500 years before Christ, 600 years before Christ, another very important community which had settled in Palestine, today Palestine, the Holy Land, what was known at the time as Canaan, a wider region, Canaan, had settled there. And this was the other side of the Abrahamic family. Abraham, when he settled in Canaan, which is now the region known as Palestine, right? His family was in Mecca, so the Ismailite branch was in Mecca, and the Davidic branch, those who came from David later on, were in what is now known as Palestine, or Judea at the time. So that family had been established for centuries in that region, and they had a kingdom. King David, King Saul, King Solomon. They had successive kings. They developed a culture, a system, a society in that region, while the other side of the family in Mecca also developed in that region. However, 600 years before the birth of Christ, a tremendous event happens. The Babylonians conquer what was known as Canaan, Judea. So that region under the Jewish family or the Jewish people was conquered by Nebuchadnezzar II. So the Babylonians conquer, and they ravage and pillage and enslave and exile Banu Israel, send them back to Babylon. Babylon is Mesopotamia. You have, for example, the Akkadian, various different sub-civilizations in that region, but it's Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent, what is now known as Iraq, effectively. It was known as Babylon, Babylon at that time. And they were sent there as slaves, as servants, as an exiled community, effectively, never to return back to Judea. In destroying that civilization, Nebuchadnezzar actually destroyed the temple of Suleiman. These are very important things for us to understand. Again, we talk about the region, the geopolitical, and also the spiritual dimensions. This is very important. Okay, so the first temple built by Suleiman in that region, King Solomon, Nebuchadnezzar II destroyed it. So the temple was destroyed, and within this temple there was the Holy of Holies. Okay, there were sacred objects, sacred rooms. He destroyed the entire temple, and that marked a significant turning point and milestone for the Jewish people. Significant that the temple was destroyed and they were exiled out of Judea into Babylon. Now, if you follow many of the religious traditions that trace back to ancient Jerusalem, for example, Rastafari, they will talk of Zion and Babylon. Zion and Babylon. Zion is the home of the Jewish kingdom. It's Palestine, it's Judea. The name was Zion, the traditional name Zion. Babylon was where the oppressive and licentious and ungodly and the polytheistic Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar had his kingdom. So in modern terms, we talk of Zion and Babylon, we're talking about good and evil. Europe has been compared to Babylon, the belly of the beast. Zion is the home of righteousness. So they talk of going back to Zion. From there we get Zionism, Zionist. Zion represents not only a spiritual state, but also a physical place where the Messiah will return and rebuild the temple. Really multifaceted, very, very important, very interesting. So Babylon represents this in the Bible, in the Old Testament. And they are enslaved and oppressed in Babylon for approximately 70 years. The God of the Old Testament promises them that at some point they will be able to return home. But because of their transgressions and their wickedness, he allowed the Babylonians to punish them and exile them. This is something that really marks the Jewish psyche. It's part of their experience, their world experience. So they develop many things. When they're in Babylon, by the way, they acquire new knowledge, new sciences. The Babylonians were advanced in magic. and sorcery, but also technology. It is said that many of the Jewish peoples who lived in Babylon also acquired this sacred or dark science, effectively, which is why you have very Jewish magic is very strong. Jewish magic is very strong, and you find that even in Medina, the magic that was inflicted upon the Prophet ﷺ was Jewish magic. It is said they trace it back to Babylon. The lost sciences, the dark arts that was in Babylon, they took it from there. For example, the Quran mentions, Surah Al-Baqarah, that the angel Al-Malakaini Bibabil, Harun wa Marut, Bibabil, Babylon. The two angels, or the two kings, according to which translation you want to take, the two angels who descended in Babylon, Babil, Harut and Marut, and they taught people sihr, magic. Okay, so the Old Testament and the Quran, they attest that Babylon is a space of not only darkness, oppression, but also the dark sciences. And it is said the Jewish migrants who lived in Babylon acquired this science and would later on develop it. Okay, so it shapes a lot in their experience. Okay? However, not long thereafter, the promise of God arrives, and they are saved by Cyrus the Great, or Kurush. Cyrus II, the second Cyrus, but known as Cyrus the Great. He is somebody who comes along and he conquers Babylon. He defeats the Babylonians. He takes control, and he issues an edict, what is now known as the Cylinder of Cyrus, because we still have the physical artifacts in cuneiform is still available. Cyrus, having conquered the region, and Cyrus, by the way, the second Cyrus, Cyrus II, he was the first. He was actually from the Achaemenid dynasty, but he was the first Persian to unify the various Persian states and empires. He created the first Persian empire, the first unified Persian empire. So he was remembered for many things. Amongst the things he was remembered for is because he was a very, very kind and tolerant ruler. So when he took over Babylon, and there were various migrant communities who had been enslaved and brought into Babylon as a subcaste, amongst them Banu Israel, he issued an edict to all the various peoples. They could return home. They could all return home. They could stay in Babylon, they could return home. Furthermore, they could rebuild the temples that had been destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar and his men. So when Banu Israel heard this, it was the answer to the promise and prayer that had been given to them several decades prior. So they returned to Zion and they rebuilt the second temple. So the first temple was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar II, and Cyrus II comes back, takes over Babylon, liberates the Jews effectively, allows them to go back home, and it is said he even helped rebuild the second temple of Suleiman. Some Quran commentators claim that he is Qarnayn. They claim he is the righteous king who ruled over the entire world and restored peace, Qarnayn. He himself, if you look at the edicts of Cyrus, or the Cyrus cylinder, he declares himself the ruler or the king of the world. He conquered the entire known realm at the time, so he said, I am the ruler of the world. So for that reason, there are many Quran commentators who would say Cyrus is Dhul Qarnayn. And this opinion is further strengthened or reinforced by the fact that the Jewish rabbis and scholars, some of them considered him a Messiah, and he is the only non-Jewish Messiah. He is considered the Messiah or a Messiah among some of the Jewish scholars. So Cyrus, although he wasn't a Jew, was held in very high regard and esteem, and they still consider him a righteous pagan, or righteous heathen, or righteous goyim. He's a righteous man, although he's not a Jew. He is also said to have been a Unitarian, a Muwahhid. He believed in one true God. At the time, the Persians had been under the Zoroastrian religion, and we'll delve into that later on. He was considered a Muwahhid. He believed in one true God. And the Old Testament, or the rabbinic records, affirm and attest to this. He was not a pagan. He was a believer in the one true God. Okay, so it's amazing that this history ties not only the Persians to the Arab and to the Jewish world, but it brings us to a point in time when we begin to see an exchange in ideas. It is said that those who were in Babylon, the Jewish people in Babylon, had taken ideas from the Babylonians. There were many stories in the Old Testament, for example, the Great Flood, or the story of Musa alayhi salam, having been put in a basket and he went down the river, somebody saved him. There are stories in the old Mesopotamian records that mirror these stories. So the biblical scholars and the critics of Abrahamic faiths, they posit the theory that actually the Babylonians had influenced Banu Israel in their time in Babylonia. And so they took these stories and incorporated it into their own biblical narrative. It's an opinion. It's an opinion. It's an opinion. But there was a great influence psychologically and culturally upon Banu Israel when they returned to Jerusalem. Furthermore, Cyrus, having been such a liberator and a friend of the Jews, his cultural impact also had an impact on the Jewish community. So they were now encountering new ideas, new concepts, and that would change their perspectives on many things. Okay, so this is a quite fascinating field in history, the history of religious traditions. Very fascinating. In the same way, Banu Israel, when they are taken as slaves in Egypt, they also adapt and adopt to Egyptian customs and traditions. So these are people who have been exposed to mighty civilizations, the Babylonians, the Persians, and also the Egyptians. And in each encounter, ideas change, they acquire new thinking, and certain principles enter their canon. Okay? So Cyrus's influence is significant because he helped them rebuild the Second Temple. He helped them rebuild the Second Temple. And this was approximately 600 years before the advent of Jesus. 600 years. So he helped them rebuild the Second Temple, which was destroyed after the First Temple was, of course, removed by Nebuchadnezzar. 600 years later, Jesus Christ is born. And among the three visitors who come to visit him, because they see this in the skies, there is a bright star, and they recognize as a portent of something important happening. So they follow the star. We know the nativity story. Among the three kings, or the wise kings, one came from, according to different stories, he came from Balthazar, came from southern Arabia. It is said either Yemen or Saba. Others say he came from Ethiopia. That's why you have an image of a black king here. Balthazar, his name was Balthazar. The others came from Persia. There was Magi. So these people here, so this image here, these people in the white robes and white turbans, they're known as Magi. Magi, Majus. Majus, Zoroastrian. Zoroastrianism, Cyrus. So they were there and they celebrated the birth of Christ. So even in the New Testament, the Zoroastrian influence is there, from the very beginning is there. And they're considered righteous kings. That's why in the Quran, the Zoroastrians, Al-Majus, are mentioned amongst Ahlul Kitab, yeah, and also the Sabians. Yeah. So it's very fascinating history. It's all coming together. It's all very interesting. So Christ appears, and now we have a new era and a new epoch, because the Jewish kingdom and the Jewish people are now divided. You will have those who will reject Christ and those who will accept Christ. So now you have Christians and Jews. It's a division in the community. And the second faith is born. From that moment onwards, up until the birth of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the region of Arabia is divided between the Christians and the Zoroastrians. And then you have some Jewish populations that reside in the northern region. So these religions are interconnected. And there are amazing correlations, amazing historical confluence and exchange among these different people. It's just fascinating stuff. And it is upon us Muslims to understand this history. We have to understand the history. And the Quran makes explicit reference to these things. If only you would pay attention when you read the ayat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If only you would pay attention. Fascinating history. Oftentimes, for example, I will remind brothers that the white thobe you wear, the beautiful white thobe you wear, the one-piece thobe you wear, and the topi you wear, the white cap, if you look at how the Zoroastrians dress, it's the same dress, except they have a bit of like an apron in the middle, and a niqab as well, when they're praying, a white niqab. But that dress code wasn't from the Arabs, it was from the Persians, the Zoroastrians. So the white topi and the white thobe, the one piece, is from the Zoroastrians. And it's not surprising if you look at the madhab in the Sunni Islam. In Sunni Islam, the madhab that focuses most on having to wear a topi to pray is the Hanafi madhab. Why is that important? It's important because Abu Hanifa, rahimahullah, was a Persian. Yeah, was a Persian. So it's just amazing stuff, and I don't want to delve into it too much, but just to kind of get you in that mode of thinking. We inherited a lot culturally, in terms of our customs, our dress, a lot from these various preceding religions. We inherited it. So next time you see a brother wearing a white topi and a white thobe, this is not how the Prophet ﷺ dressed. His companions did not dress that way. If you want to look at how they dressed, traditionally look at the Yemenis, the izar, that what we know as lungi, that sarong, that thing you wrap around your waist, right? And some of them didn't wear anything on top, just the loincloth. Others had on top of it another cloth. That's how they dressed traditionally in the Arabian Peninsula. Those white thobes and garments were from the higher civilizations, those who didn't have to work the field as often, those who were a bit more, you could say, urbanite, the Persians. The white thobes was from them. So Christ is born in 600 years later, and we have a new age in history. Prior to Christ is before Christ, and after Christ, or before common era and after common era. And so in that next 600 years before the birth of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, a lot of developments in Arabia happen. Fascinating, mind-boggling, in fact, developments that happen. I want you to focus on this division of timelines, because we have a significant development 600 years before Christ. 600 years before Christ, we have the Jewish communities removed from Judea, and Cyrus, as a Messiah, comes about and saves them. Then 600 years later, we have Jesus, a Messiah, at least according to the Christians and to the Muslims, comes to restore the Jewish community. Another 600 years, we have the final Messiah, the final messenger, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, come once again to remind them to come back to the obedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the duration of 600 is not inconsequential. It's quite fascinating, actually, that every 600 years, Allah sent them somebody to remind them to come back to his obedience. And they rejected the last two, Muhammad and Isa, alayhi and accepted Cyrus, because he was a king, of course, and he liberated them. So Christianity is born. Now, shortly thereafter, 70 years after the birth of Christ, another invasion breaks out in Judea. So now they are kicked out a second time. And the Quran mentions this, by the way, mentions this. You will cause fasad in the land, you will transgress twice, and Allah will send you his slaves who you cannot resist. In other words, overwhelming might and power to rout you out of your land and to humiliate you and to kick you out. Twice it will happen. The first time it happened under the Babylonians, the second time under the Romans. Okay, and this second expulsion actually lasted up until now. So once they were kicked out, and Jesus in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, he actually prophesied it. The temple will be destroyed. One of the signs will be destroyed. So 70 years after his birth, they are again invaded. Now, the circumstance around this has to be explained. The Jewish community at that time was being colonized by the Romans. The Romans were there, they had colonized, and they were ruling over the Bani Israel. And they were discriminatory. And exploiting the tax collection was excessive. So some of the Jewish sects wanted to revive an independent Judea, specifically one sect known as the Sicarii sect. They were like the Mujahideen, the jihadi sect of the Jewish community. And they wanted to revive effectively the Khilafah in their own terms. So they began to revolt and rebel. Add to that, the Greek community that was also present in Judea was also antagonistic towards the Jewish community. So there was intercultural, intercommunal, unsettled disputes, but also fiscal pressure. And so it's like a boiling pot, a combustion engine, and effectively it exploded. So the Romans sent their commanders and approximately 60 to 80,000 soldiers to quell the rebellion. And it lasted a couple of years before it actually succeeded. When they finally quelled the rebellion and broke the resistance and killed so many Jews and exiled the rest of them, they burnt the second temple. So the second temple that was built afterwards with the help of Cyrus was destroyed and looted. And the sacred objects you can see here, alabaster, like a replica of what had happened, they're making off with all the sacred items from the temple. These are the Romans. They're looting the temple, the second temple. The only thing that remained of the temple was the western wall. The only thing that remained of the second temple of Suleiman was the western wall, which is still there today. And it is said, when the Jews were kicked out the second time, they never returned as a community. They became a diaspora for the last 2,000 years, up until 1948. And now they have come back and re-established what is known now as Israel. They want to rebuild the third temple. However, this time, they believe that the one who will help them rebuild the temple is the true Messiah. In the same way the second temple was built by the help of the second Messiah, or the Messiah who they accepted, Cyrus, they are now awaiting the final Messiah to help them rebuild the third temple. This is prehistoric information that still applies today. So the psychology of the Jewish Zionist who resides in that region today is still affected by the trauma that they suffered at the hands of the Romans, because the Arabs did not kick them out. It was the Romans who kicked them out. And ironically, the Romans are bringing them back today and saying to them, we're going to help you reestablish. And your enemy is the Muslim. No. The Romans kicked them out, and the Romans bringing them back in now. Right? And so this second expulsion, however, I want you to imagine Arabia. And Arabia to the north has Romans and Greeks and various civilizations and some of the Persians in the northern region. And in the southern region, you have Aksum, you have Saba, and you have the Himyaritic region. Two significant events happen in history, okay, that will push two populations inwards towards Arabia. From the southern region, there are floods, the Great Flood in the Dam of Ma'rib, that pushes Arabs out of Yemen up north towards, for example, Medina, Mecca, Ta'if, and those regions. They move up north. While in the north, the second expulsion, it forces a large amount of Jewish people out of Judea into the region below. Some of them also go to Persia, Iran. So they have to leave. And one of the closest regions was Arabia, or what's known as Arabia Petra, which is the Nabatea, Jordan, those regions, and the regions in the northern region. So they move downwards. And amongst those people who move into that region is a small community of Jews who settled in a place known as Yathrib. Yathrib, the old name of Medina, or the old name or the old region, was actually a Jewish enclave. It was a Jewish enclave. So they settled there. And a few centuries later, the Arabs who come from the southern region, who were leaving because of the flood, some of them joined them in Yathrib, Aus and Khazraj. Yeah, that's how Yathrib became a city. The Jewish people who were running away from the Roman persecution in Palestine settled there, and then the Arabs coming from the southern region settled there. Some of the Jews also went to Persia. They went to Persia. It's ironic because if you look at in eschatology, Islamic eschatology, in the end times, when the Messiah arrives, you will have the false Messiah arrives. He will be supported by a legion of Jews coming out of Persia. Coming out of where? Persia. And they're going to help him, and he'll attempt to rebuild and to go back to their homeland, to Zion. Okay, so that history is still there. Persia, or now Iran, has been a safe haven for Jews from that time onwards to this moment. So when people say Persians or Iranians are Semitic, anti-Semitic, look at the historical record. These Jewish people went to Arabia and to Persia for safe haven, and they established communities and they stayed there. From that moment till now, they're still there. Right? They left in 48 though, when Ben-Gurion called them to migrate by hook or by crook to Jerusalem. Yeah? But up until then, they remained in these regions. They had no problem. They had no problem. There are three types of Jewish communities following this great migration. You have the Mizraim Jew. The Mizraim Jew is the one who never left the peninsula, that region, Asia Minor, Asia, Arabia. They never left. They remained within that region. They're known as the Mizraim Jews. You have the Sephardic Jews, those who went into the Mediterranean regions, for example, the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, Portugal. They're known as Sephardic Jews. And then you have the final Jew, the Ashkenazi. The Ashkenazi were not indigenous to that region. They were not in North Africa. They were not in Asia Minor. They were not in Arabia. They came from Western Europe. And they came from the Caucasus Mountains. I don't want to get into that history. But these are three distinct communities of Jewish people who had to migrate. The third category didn't migrate. They came from external sources. So now that they want to go back to Zion, it is the third category that claims to be the authentic Jews who belonged to Zion. And it's accurately, historically, biologically, scientifically false. They never came from there. The actual Jews who can claim to go back to their homeland are the Mizraim Jews. Those who before 48, Ben-Gurion called them to come. They wanted to bolster up the population. Even the Knesset disagreed with that because it was too much. They couldn't handle that influx of people. So he fabricated a story that the Jewry of the world was under persecution, especially under the Muslims. And they had to be repatriated for their own safekeeping. This is after almost 2,000 years. Suddenly now they have problems. Suddenly now they have problems. If you go to Yemen, if you go to Morocco, if you go to regions even in Iran, there are ancient Jewish communities and sites and castles that are still there. They were welcome because they were indeed the people of the land. They were Semitic people. They were Middle Easterners. They were literally people of the land. And you can still find these people in those regions. Right? So they leave. Now, a faction settles in Arabia. And they settle in Yathrib, in Medina. It is this faction of Jewish people, Mizraim Jews, who later become Arabized, that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam will encounter and will communicate with. Yeah. This is the community he will encounter and communicate with and remind them about their history. The story you read every Friday, if you're a Muslim, the ayah, the surah is Surah Al-Kahf. The reason why that surah was revealed, there's a historical reason. There's a historical reason. It is that in the early phase of Islam, the Quraysh were encountering the stories of the Quran. The Quran would mention prophets, Musa, Isa, Ibrahim, and to them it was strange. They never heard about the stories in that way. So they went to Medina because that was a community of Jewish people, And they were known to be people who, of the book. Ahlul Kitab. In fact, the Quran says, فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. Ahlul Dhikri, if you look at the actual tafsir, these are Banu Israel. These are the Jews and the Christians. فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلُ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنْتُمْ. Ask those of remembrance, those who have the remembrance. If you are stuck somewhere, if you don't understand, ask them. That was the Jewish and the Christian community. The Muslims were asked to go and consult them about certain stories, which is why later on, Rasul said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, concerning Israeliyat, لا نصدقهم ولا نكذبهم. When we hear their stories, we neither affirm nor do we belie them, but we measure it against the Quran and Sunnah. So you cannot say this is completely false or completely true. You have to measure. Okay? And again, in our historiography, you have a problem here because later converts into Islam, especially from Yemen, for example, Wahb ibn al-Munabbih, they take a lot of Israeliyat and they utilize it to explain Islamic history and ayat. And Imam Malik was very, very against this. It's a long story, but that influenced our history as well. That's what I'm trying to say here. So these people were present in Arabia. And when the Quraysh had problems encountering Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they would go to Medina and ask the questions. Tell us about this prophet that he's talking about. Who's Musa? Who is Isa? Tell us about, is he telling the truth? So Banu Israel in Medina would tell them, Antum ahda minhum. You, the polytheists, are more guided than them, the Muslims. The Quran mentions this. You are more guided in your polytheism than in what Muhammad is preaching, even though he's preaching about the one true God and our Bible is true and the Old Testament is true, as in it has a divine source. You are more guided. And so the Quraysh said, we have to advise us what we should ask him to test his knowledge. Is he truly a prophet of Allah? So the Jewish rabbis, they give 3 questions. They told the Quraysh envoys, ask him these 3 questions. And if he is a prophet, if he truly is a prophet, he'll be able to answer the questions for you. One of the questions is, who is the man who conquered the East and the West? Who is the man who what? Conquered the East and the West. Now again, I'm not telling you that Qarnayn is Cyrus, but the historical context explains a lot. Cyrus was the one who they looked up to. Some of them considered him a messiah. He was the one who liberated them and who rebuilt the temple. So personally, I believe it was a strong indication he was Cyrus. I don't believe it was Alexander. I believe it's because there's no reason for the Jews to focus on Cyrus or to focus on that story. So they said, ask him first and foremost, who is Qarnayn? The Arabs had no idea about Qarnayn. So he had to, if he was a prophet, he could explain to you. Secondly, ask him, how did Banu Israel enter Egypt? How did Banu Israel, how did the Jewish people find their way to Egypt? Because they were not indigenous to Egypt. What was the story behind that? And then they asked him a 3rd question, I believe, about the sleepers. Who were the sleepers in the cave? And this happened in modern day Turkey, okay, Mediterranean region. So the Quran responds. Yeah? They said, they ask about Qarnayn. Qarnayn is a man who, a righteous slave of ours who is sent along the land. So this story was very important for them because it's part of their history, their genesis into Arabia. It's part of their genesis into Arabia. We could go on for a long time. It's very fascinating history, by the way. I would implore you, if you are, if this is something that you want to learn more about, to study the Roman Empire and its presence in Judea in the 1st century after Christ, 70 after Christ. Very interesting, in how the Jewish community migrated, and many of them settled in either Persia or in Arabia. So then we move on 100 years later. So approximately, it's estimated here. It's estimated in the 1st century sometime, soon after being kicked out, this time permanently, they moved to Yathrib. They established a community in Yathrib, what then became Medina. And this is why, when you look at the Sahifat Medina, which is the first constitution in Islam. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ had a charter in Medina. It was a written document. And in fact, of all the documents that critics of Islam refute as being false and fabricated, this is the only one that is almost unanimously agreed upon. It was a factual document. The constitution of the Charter of Medina is the only document in Islam that even the critics say this was a historically accurate document. And in that document, the Jewish community are considered part of the Ummah. They are part of the Ummah. And they are given equal citizenship rights. They are allowed to fight. They are allowed to defend the realms, and they are part of the community. Of course, they would betray that, and they would be expelled once again. So they had a place in Medina. They owned the marketplace, the economy. They had patron tribes among the Arabs. Some took Aus, others took Khazraj, and would patronize them to fight wars against one another. So they had been there from the very beginning. That's the point. In fact, now there are websites and projects coming out of Israel that are scanning and monitoring all of the historical sites that belong to the Jewish people in North Africa and also in North Arabia. And there are many sites that were traditionally Jewish, going back several centuries. Yeah? So their presence there was one that was established. Very, very important.
If you're enjoying this lecture and would like to learn more about the history of ancient Arabia in all of her glory, then you will love Civilis Arabica. This series of lectures is delivered as part of an annual history program for only £10 a month. In it, you'll be able to uncover 2,000 years of pre-Islamic history through an immersive and unique learning experience delivered exclusively through the official Historion app. As a Patreon member, you may register onto this program by selecting the essential tier available on the membership page for instant access to over 7 complete and unique courses ranging from the history of the Umayyad kingdom through to the rise and fall of the empires of Mali and Abyssinia. You will then be granted access to 7 complete and individual courses. Subscriptions may be cancelled at any time. There are no minimum terms or commitments.